Hey everybody, HomeSliceHenry here, and in today's video, I'm going to be revealing my best Great League team for this current rotation. Now this team, I've had amazing results with, climbing up to 3198 ELO, which at the time of recording, should be about top 10 to top 15 on the global leaderboards. This is an improved version of the team that I used to hit Legend. The backline of the team remains the same. Brick Break Furret is the safe switch, Shadow Counter Annihilate is the closer, but Voltage Fortress is gone, and in its place is the better steel type of Tinkaton. While this team does have some ABA weaknesses like Talonflame and Gourgeist, this team has been exceedingly consistent for me. So without further ado, let's hop into the matches, and in game number 1, we pick up the Dream Lead Tinkaton into Shadow Mightyena. Shadow Mightyena teams are all about trying to brute force switch advantage no matter the cost, and if they don't get switch advantage, they're probably going to be in a very tough spot. The really nice thing about the spot that I'm in right here is I have two very strong counters to Mightyena, so switch advantage doesn't really matter to me. Instead, I feel pretty okay losing switch in the mid game in exchange for farm on either Annihilate or on the Tinkaton. I farm up here trying to CMP tie them because I wanted to get the damage before they applied a second Rock Tomb debuff. I end up letting through an entire Volt Switch, but realistically that's not going to matter. I don't need switch advantage to win this game. Rock Tomb takes the knockout, I can snipe down with Annihilate, and what is that Mightyena going to do? My opponent reveals in the back they have Gourgeist. Gourgeist is allegedly a Pokemon that I am core broken by, however, I feel like I beat almost every Gourgeist that I play against. Rage Fist connects, that's devastating damage. The opponent can't really afford to shield the first, because if they do, the future ones are going to do more. Now, I can outpace them. Even the boosted counters, they're double resisted, but they are adding up quite a bit on the Gourgeist. Gourgeist ends up no shielding, in comes Shadow Mightyena. I'm just going to let this through, they have to crunch if they want to knock me out, and I have so much energy on Tinkaton that I can just win the game with a triple bulldoze. So this game ends up being a very calm game 1 victory. It didn't even really matter that they had a core breaker in the Gourgeist, because Gourgeist was very easily handled. My opponent ends up no shielding, calling the bulldoze, but debuff or not, there's just no way Mightyena is ever beating Tinkaton, and we take the game 1 win. We pick up a very negative lead in the next match, Tinkaton into Skeledirge. I spoke about core breakers, and here they are. I save switch into Furret, my opponent responds with a Guzzlord, and unfortunately I throw on alignment again. These battles were during the Go Battle Thursday after I had already done a bunch of sets that day, and as you can see, unfortunately, my timing was slipping just a little bit. They fire off Brutal Swing. The fact that I threw an alignment means that unfortunately, I'm not going to make it to a Brick Break. I could make a Swift, but I view energy on Tinkaton as a lot more valuable here. So, instead of throwing that energy, I'm just going to go for a massive farm down on Tinkaton. Guzzlord can never damage Tinkaton. It has an incredibly terrible matchup. I can take advantage of that and get a huge energy head start. In comes Skeledirge, I fire off Gigaton Hammer. This will inflict some massive damage onto the Skeledirge, and it's a simultaneous switch Shadow Annihilate into Greninja, and this game should be a win. Greninja is just going to get one shield counter down. Oh my goodness, look at the damage. They just get absolutely deleted. In comes Skeledirge, and by virtue of taking that massive Gigaton Hammer damage earlier, suddenly they are looking very, very low. They're going to undertap, firing up the Torch Song, boosting up their damage. But this match has completely flipped on its head. I fire off another Rage Fist. The question is, can I survive 2 more Incinerates? If I can't, I'm going to have to transfer the damage. It looks like I can't. I do 4. Transfer the Incinerate onto the Tinkaton. My opponent is so low, they're forced to fire off energy. Torch Song takes the knockout. In comes the Annihilate, and we're only 1 off the Rage Fist. So back-to-back Fire-type Core Breakers, this team just simply does not care. We KO Skeledirge and take the win. Unfortunately, we've got more Core Breakers on the lead in the next match, as I lead Tinkaton into Gourgeist. Now, Gourgeist does take a massive amount of damage from Gigaton Hammer, so to me, this is a very safe bulldoze. However, my opponent ends up calling the bait, and suddenly, I'm in a lot of trouble. If they no-shield the Gigaton Hammer, they lose almost their entire health bar, so that is a wild no-shield. Luckily, we're able to redeem ourselves as we catch the Shadow Ball onto Furret. Now, my Furret is not running Trailblaze, but my opponent has no way to know that. So I farm up to the Trailblaze, get the shield with the Brick Break, and now my opponent is debuffed. Aqua Tail, Mud Bomb, neither move will threaten a KO. They go for the Aqua Tail. I fire off the Swift, and to my shock, my opponent is running a massively attack-weighted Quagsire. Quagsire usually loses that charge attack priority time by like 4. So for Quagsire to win it, my opponent has a very terrible IV Quagsire. That Quagsire has a massive amount of attack on it. They will fire off energy, knocking out the Furret. They go for the Mud Bomb, covering for a catch, but I send it Annihilate and get a full farm down. In the back is Jellicent. They have all the Core Breakers in the world, and it's just simply not going to matter. Shadow Annihilate farms up to the back-to-back Rage Fist. Well, 1 shy of the back-to-back Rage Fist. I'll be able to secure the knockout here, and then they can bring back in the Gourgeist, but Gourgeist can never farm down. I still have a very healthy Tinkaton in the back as well. It turns out we're not even going to need it. This is the Shadow Annihilate show. Shadow Annihilate taking back-to-back knockouts on Ghost types, and we take the win. We move to the next game, leading Tinkaton into Tinkaton, the perfect mirror match. The Tinkaton mirror is always a little bit awkward because a Gigaton Hammer plus a Bulldoze is not enough to secure the knockout. I have a very high rank Tinkaton, it's the rank 9, so unfortunately I will lose a lot of charge attack priority ties. However, my opponent ends up going for a Bulldoze bait, so that actually ends up working out pretty well for me. I fire off the Gigaton Hammer, and I'm just going to look to shield and overfarm. My opponent has enough for the Gigaton. I know it will not knock out, however, I can now threaten a Gigaton Hammer, bait with a Bulldoze, and try and make life as uncomfortable as possible for my opponent. So I farm up a ton of energy, go for the Bulldoze, and I'm able to get the shield. Now I can go for Bulldoze number 2, and I still have a very healthy Tinkaton. My opponent ends up double shielding. If they're double shielding, I'm expecting they're very weak to Tinkaton in the back, so I make kind of a weird play. I end up catching Gigaton Hammer onto Furret. This might seem like a terrible play, but judging by the double shield, I'm expecting they're very weak to Tinkaton in the back, and that thought process is immediately vindicated as out comes Mandibuzz. Furret can't really do anything into Mandibuzz, so I figure if I'm in the matchup, I may as well debuff their defense with Brick Break. Brick Break, not really going to do much of anything here, but at the very least, now that they're debuffed, Swift will do extra damage. Mandibuzz typically going to be running Foul Play and Shadow Ball. Shadow Ball will be hitting for some sizable neutral damage onto Tinkaton. I have to watch for my opponent to switch back into their own Tink. They do just that, in comes Tinkaton. I can't let this energy go, so I put up the shield, and I pivot into Annihilate. Annihilate gets the counter down. My opponent should be 4 off of a Shadow Ball on Mandibuzz, which is very good news for me. In comes the Mandibuzz. Mandibuzz can make the foul play here, but they commit to the Shadow Ball. I make the Ice Punch, and this is guaranteed to secure the knockout. They brought in the Mandibuzz. Hopefully they're weak in the back, and they are. My opponent also running the Tinkaton plus Furret Core. Now, I just get to make an Ice Punch with the Shadow Annihilate. Ice Punch is going to connect. Furret hangs on with very low HP remaining, but now it's my turn to survive. I'm running the high-rank Shadow Annihilate. We survive the Trailblaze and take the win. Picking up a terrible lead in the next match, Tinkaton into Shadow Talonflame. So out of 5 games, we've had 4 that had pretty massive core breakers. However, this team is 3 for 3 so far taking down the core breakers. I save switch into Furret, fire off the Swift, and my opponent is going to put up the shield. That is a little bit unfortunate for me, because I did want to try and get some damage onto that Talonflame. Talonflame goes for the fly, there's the switch, in comes Shadow Sableye, and this is a very good bait out for me. My Annihilate obviously can't do anything into Shadow Sableye, so my goal here is just to try and let the Furret get KO'd and go for massive farm on Tinkaton, because that Talonflame already took quite a lot of damage from Sucker Punches. They're probably low enough that I can knock them out with Gigaton Hammer. And this is part of what makes Tinkaton so incredibly broken, as even when Steel-type moves are resisted, Tinkaton frequently just does not care. They can now bring back in the Talonflame. I'm expecting they're probably weak to Tinkaton in the back, so I will go for a pretty devious Bulldoze bait. Firing off Bulldoze into the Talonflame, we get the shield. Talonflame forced to undertap, otherwise I'd be able to outpace and knock them out with Gigaton. They go for the Flame Charge. I fire off the Gigaton Hammer. This will be the end of Talonflame. So far, they've had 2 counters to Annihilate on their team, and in the back, they have the Azumarill, and unfortunately, we are going to lose a game with this team. They had 3 hard counters to Shadow Annihilate. We were able to get rid of the Talonflame. The Talonflame wasn't an issue, but unfortunately, Azumarill in the back, just too much. I can bank a Bulldoze, but realistically, it's not going to matter. I would need to make a second Gigaton Hammer, and I simply do not have enough HP. So Azumarill is going to get to bubble me down, so close to the Gigaton, but so far away. And unfortunately, we will finally lose a game to one of those core-breaking fire types. But I think we did make that pretty close. We see a familiar lead in the next match, Tinkaton into Tinkaton. Again, I do want to reiterate that I think this mirror is a very awkward one, just because I always like going for the Gigaton Hammer first, because people very rarely shield the first, because they don't want to shield a Bulldoze bait and end up getting debuffed. However, by landing a Gigaton, you're then in a spot where the Bulldoze will not take the knockout, and I assume my Tinkaton will probably lose charge attack priority. So I just go for whatever damage I can get. I fire off Bulldoze, knowing it will not knock out, and my opponent will be able to survive. They bank Gigaton Hammer, in comes a Feraligatr, and this matchup is where Brick Break is a little bit worse. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to win the Zero Shield here. However, I do still feel like Furret has quite a bit of play, because even though I can't win the Zeros, I can fire off the Brick Break and then go for a 1-shield farm down. This ensures that my Furret exits with a ton of energy, and importantly, Furret wins charge stack priority over the Tinkaton. That means Tinkaton cannot get brought in here, or they're going to have to give up their shield or lose their energy. In the back, they have a Guzzlord, and I can fire off Brick Break. Brick Break is going to be shielded. There's the switch into Shadow Counter Annihilate, and these counters are absolutely shredding through the Guzzlord. I know they have a Gigaton Hammer banked, so I can never afford to shield the Brutal Swing. There's the switch into Tinkaton, and Tinkaton will fire off energy. Tinkaton just going to go for the Bulldoze, fishing for a debuff. Back in comes the Guzzlord, but unfortunately for my opponent, the damage is already done. Annihilate boosts itself up with a Rage Fist. We're going to get the full counter down and secure the win. We pick up the Dream Lead in the next match, Tinkaton into Furret. This matchup is so dominant that Tinkaton even down a shield wins the matchup. Opponent save switches into a Shadow Drifblim, and unfortunately Shadow Drifblim just has no play into Furret. Furret just has such a commanding matchup that even though they can debuff me with 2 Shadow Icy Winds, I'm just going to fully farm them down. I'm going to get pretty low, but honestly this is probably the best case scenario, as I will exit with quite a lot of energy. The energy is not going to do much, but it will hit for super effective into the Furret. My opponent sends in their own Tinkaton. I'm going to fire off a Brick Break, save the second, and then repivot back into my Tinkaton. Even though my opponent is debuffed, they're kind of trapped on the field because they can't afford to send in their Furret into the Tinkaton because Furret doesn't really have any play there. My opponent will go for the Bulldoze bait. Thankfully, they do not get the debuff. I Bulldoze bait back. My opponent calls it, but not only do I get the debuff, but I also do way more damage than Bulldoze normally does due to that Brick Break debuff. I go for a second Bulldoze, I get a second debuff. I really didn't need Bulldoze debuffs to win this game, but it is definitely making things a lot easier. My opponent goes for broke, full sending Gigaton Hammer. I overfarm slightly and go for another Bulldoze. I've gotten them low enough and they're so debuffed that I can probably knock them out here with a Brick Break, so I send back in the Furret. Furret fires off the Brick Break KOs the Tinkaton. My opponent sends in their own Furret, and unfortunately, I don't even think I'm going to need my Annihilate for this game. That's how dominant the Tinkaton plus Furret core was here. Tinkaton gonna be hit with a Trailblaze, actually, not a Brick Break. I was expecting Brick Break, but they are still running a Trailblaze Furret. I don't think Trailblaze Furret is bad per se, but for this team, especially as a save switch, I think Brick Break is required because a lot of the times you're having steel types like Fortress or Corviknight sent into you, and Brick Break is just gonna work a lot better there. We see a relic from a past meta on the lead in the next match, leading Tinkaton into Shadow Marowak. Obviously not an amazing lead matchup, but my backline does very well into Marowak. I save switch into Furret, and it's very important that I fire off the Swift as soon as I get it. My opponent knows this can't be a Trailblaze, so they have high incentive to let this go, but suddenly the Marowak is low enough that with a few Fairy Winds and a Bulldoze later in the game, Tinkaton can actually deal with it. Bone Club is going to connect, I'm going to keep farming, and my opponent sends in Corviknight. Corviknight is not going to have a great time against Furret because I have access to Brick Break. Brick Break debuffs their defense, it ramps up my Sucker Punch damage even more, and now I can bank a switch for later and send in the Tinkaton. I feel very comfortable with sending back in the Tinkaton here just because I know the Marowak is already so incredibly low. They can fire off Air Cutter, they can fire off Payback, everything's going to be resisted. They keep going for Air Cutters, they keep not getting boosts, and they are just really not doing a meaningful amount of damage to the Tinkaton. Another Air Cutter comes through, I'm going to farm up just shy of 100 energy and full send Gigaton Hammer. They're already debuffed from that Brick Break, so that will take the knockout, and now in comes Marowak. Marowak hit with a Bulldoze, this will come very close to securing the knockout. I send in Annihilate, in the back, they have a Lapras, and this game is over. Shadow Annihilate just gets to fully 2-shield through this Lapras. Psywave hits for super effective damage, but unfortunately, Lapras cannot boost up its attack like Annihilate. So I have a very safe win condition of just shielding everything Lapras throws, punching through everything. They can make a last second charge attack, but I'll put up the shield. At this point, my opponent doesn't really have a path forward in this game. I undertap here just so I can boost up my counter damage before the Marowak comes back in. In comes the Marowak, they fall to the counter, and that's a win. We see a pretty decent lead in the next match, Tinkaton into Galarian Corsola. Now, Tinkaton does barely win the Zero Shield matchup here. Emphasis on barely, because 2 Nightshades plus all the Astonishes puts Tinkaton very, very low. Gigaton Hammer is going to connect. That's some pretty massive damage. My opponent farms up just shy of the back-to-back Nightshades, and they're going to start unleashing energy. Nightshade number 1 is going to land. They're able to outpace and make Nightshade number 2. Tinkaton can hang on here, but it's not going to beat by much. Nightshade lands, and that's where having a high-ranked Tinkaton is very nice. I assume a worse Tinkaton could not actually win the zeros. Gigaton Hammer lands, taking the knockout, and what does my opponent have in the back? They are definitely waiting their time here, and they send in a Shadow Celio. Well, I have a very good answer to Shadow Celio, so I'm just going to send in the Shadow Annihilate. If they're throwing energy, it's highly likely they're going for a Body Slam bait just to ensure they can make it to a surf. But if they're staying in and still not switching out, it seems like they don't have a good answer to fighting type damage in the back. So I'm just going to Rage Fist and go for a double shield. It doesn't really matter what order they end up throwing their charge stacks in. As long as I have a boosted Shadow Annihilate for what turns out to be a Licky Licky in the back, this game is going to be over. Guaranteed win condition now is to throw one counter and then send in the Furret, because Furret will always be able to win this endgame. My opponent ends up waiting there, and I believe they end up firing up a bad mana Shadow Ball because they know there's just no way out in this game. Unfortunately for them, once Corsola fell, there was nothing that could stop Shadow Annihilate. We've actually got the same leads as the last game in the final match. Tinkaton into Galarian Corsola once again. It's very tempting to try and go for a catch out of this matchup into Furret, but considering there's a Shadow Annihilate in the back, it's very important to just get rid of the Corsola. Here, my opponent makes a pretty monumental error. They end up throwing on alignment. By giving me a free Fairy Wind, I can now go for the charge attack priority tie Gigaton Hammer to their second Nightshade. And unless they want to lose this energy, they're going to have to give me a shield. Gigaton Hammer is going to be shielded. I'm very happy to let this go. I can just farm them down with Furret, and then hopefully Annihilate will be good in the back. In comes Furret, they send in Bug Bite Shadow Fortress, I send in Annihilate, and in that position, my opponent resigns the match. All in all, I ended up having some fantastic results with this team. I don't believe I had a single negative set with this team as I climbed all the way up to 3198 ELO. I also ran it for a bit on my wife's account, running a non-Shadow Annihilate because she just doesn't have the Shadow, and ended up going positive there as well. I do think the Shadow Annihilate is better than the non-Shadow, but the non-Shadow is still decently playable. It just plays like a very different Pokemon. I do think that Tinkaton is a pretty big upgrade for this team over the Volt Switch Fortress. Volt Switch Fortress did have a time and place, and I still don't think it's bad by any means, but Tinkaton's bulk and Tinkaton's ability to inflict just horrendous amounts of damage, even when Gigaton Hammer is resisted, it allows it to be flexible in a way that I really feel like Volt Switch Fortress was not quite able to achieve. So I'm a huge fan of Tinkaton. I've run Tinkaton in a ton of teams since the Calm Day happened, and I'm probably going to keep running it, because Tinkaton is just an absolute powerhouse. It is a force to be reckoned with, and I am a huge fan of Tinkaton in this meta. I really like Tinkaton metas as a whole, and I think that this is the most flexible iteration of Tinkaton that we've seen, where I guess if you give a Pokemon a move that's strong enough, even in its bad matchups, it can still inflict some pretty terrifying damage. I was a bit worried that the Brick Break Furret wouldn't work as well in a Tinkaton meta, and I'll be honest, if you say switch Furret and they answer with a Tinkaton, it's probably going to be a very tough game, because this team doesn't have a designated Tinkaton answer. The Tinkaton answer is Tinkaton. But I do think that Furret outside of those Tinkaton matchups still feels incredibly neutral. With Brick Break, even if they send in something like a Corviknight or a Fortress, you can still do very well there, and Shadow Annihilate is just oh so very good at saving 2 shields for it, and then just countering everything down. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed watching today's video, please do help support the channel by leaving a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And an extra special thank you as always to our channel members here on YouTube. The support you guys provided the channel is so appreciated, so thank you guys oh so very much. And until next time, I've been HomeSliceHenry.